This video is sponsored by Delete Me. The smoke is visible from almost 100 miles away, not from an attack or damage, but from Russia's flagship aircraft carrier, simply trying to move forward. This is Admiral Kuznetsov, the pride of Russia's Navy, leaving a trail like a slug across every ocean it limps through. For decades, it has suffered through disasters and countless indignities. But now, in 2016, Admiral Kuznetsov is ready for war. Su-33 fighter jets line its deck as it steams towards its first actual combat mission in Syria. The Kremlin has staked Russia's naval prestige on this deployment, a chance to finally prove the carrier's worth after years of embarrassment. And the brave scene may have worked, if not for one tiny detail. Following in the wake of the mighty ship was something most unusual. Not an escorting battleship, not a shielding destroyer, but instead, a happy little tugboat. Russia's only aircraft carrier might need some help getting home. From day one, Admiral Kuznetsov suffered from a fundamental flaw: exposure. Its thick black smoke and persistent mechanical failures weren't just inconveniences. They broadcast her vulnerabilities to those looking to harm her. Today, many of us unknowingly share a similar problem. Online data brokers quietly expose our sensitive personal information: home addresses, phone numbers, family connections, even property details, making us easy targets for identity thieves, phishing attacks, or unwanted online harassment. At Dark Seas, we've personally enlisted our sponsor, Delete Me, to avoid the kind of public vulnerability that haunts Admiral Kuznetsov. Delete Me's dedicated privacy specialists continuously track down and remove your personal information from hundreds of data broker websites throughout the year. After setting up our account, Delete Me quickly sent us a detailed privacy report, revealing dozens of data brokers holding our sensitive information. Within days, the team got to work, scrubbing our personal details clean, significantly reducing our digital exposure. One of Delete Me's standout features is its continuous monitoring, regularly scanning and removing data if brokers try to repost it. Their customer support is always ready, providing customized removals to address your individual privacy needs. Delete Me even offers family plans to protect your loved ones, because data brokers often expose information about your entire family. Don't leave your online security as exposed as Admiral Kuznetsov's smoky trail. Go to joindeleteme.com/darkseas and use promo code DARKSEAS for 20% off your Delete Me subscription. Protect your privacy, because unlike Kuznetsov, your vulnerabilities don't need to be visible to the entire world. The race for a Soviet carrier. Even after the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, the world remained at risk. This time, the threat came from two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy entire cities in an instant. In preparation for what seemed an inevitable descent toward World War III, the Soviets took inspiration from Hitler, seeking to replicate his U-boat campaign by launching a vast fleet of submarines that could sever the lifeline of Allied forces, cutting American supply vessels before they ever reached Europe. But just as the Soviets were setting their plans into motion, the United States unveiled a weapon they hadn't accounted for: ballistic missile submarines. These silent killers needed no supply lines and no refueling stops. They could slip undetected into the deep, creep close to Soviet targets, and unleash a nuclear hit before the enemy even knew they were there. This forced the Soviets to rethink their entire naval doctrine. Their submarine fleet was suddenly helpless in the face of an enemy that could strike from beyond their reach. In the face of war, the Soviets would need aviation cruisers capable of launching aircraft to patrol the seas and hunt down enemy submarines. But unlike their American rivals, who'd been refining the art of carrier warfare since the early 20th century, the Soviet Union had spent decades prioritizing missile-armed surface ships over aircraft carriers. Their first attempt at a carrier came in the form of the Moskva class, the first operational aircraft carrier of the Soviet fleet, at least in name. In truth, the Moskva was a far cry from the massive steel giants of the U.S. Navy. It carried no fixed-wing aircraft or fighter jets capable of dogfighting American air patrols. Instead, it was equipped with a modest air wing of just 14 helicopters, its only purpose to act as submarine hunters. The Soviets, lacking the expertise to build gas turbine engines for a 10,000-ton ship, resorted to high-pressure steam propulsion. This condemned the Moskva class to a pace of just 24 knots, or 28 miles per hour, a most underwhelming speed for a warship of its category. But the worst failure wasn't mechanical, it was strategic. By the time the first Moskva-class carrier finally entered service in 1967, the United States had already leapfrogged ahead. The Polaris A-3 ballistic missile, carried by American SSBNs, had a range of over 2,700 miles. That meant U.S. submarines no longer needed to sneak close to Soviet waters. They could fire their missiles from the middle of the ocean and still hit their targets. The Moskva class was rendered obsolete before it had even begun its mission. Only 2 ships were ever built before the program was quietly abandoned. Upping the game. After the Moskva-class failure, Soviet naval planners took a more aggressive approach. They required a warship that could project power and be capable of carrying fixed-wing fighter jets for improved defensive capabilities. Thus, in the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union built 4 Kiev-class carriers, each a strange hybrid, part guided missile cruiser, part aircraft carrier. At nearly 900 feet in length, the Kiev-class was almost as large as the nuclear-powered U.S. Navy's Nimitz-class carriers. The ship's front half looked like a traditional guided missile cruiser, bristling with P-500 Basalt anti-ship missiles and M-11 Storm air defense systems, while the rear half had a small, angled flight deck, allowing it to operate up to 12 Yak-38 Forger VTOL fighters. However, while this seemed like a step toward true carrier warfare, in reality, it was another failure. Kiev's air wing was too small and unable to carry the radar-equipped AWACS planes needed for long-range detection. The Yak-38 was underpowered, with a short range and a weak payload. It stood no chance against U.S. Navy aircraft like the F-14 Tomcat. And while the Kiev class was heavily armed, its Yak-38 fighters were no match for U.S. carrier-based aircraft. In a real confrontation, the Soviet ships would struggle to close the distance before being targeted by U.S. carrier strike groups, bombers, and submarines operating well beyond their effective range. Time was running out. The Soviet Union was economically collapsed, politically unstable, and technologically behind. If they wanted to stand a chance against the U.S. Navy's carriers, they needed a real aircraft carrier. The dream of Admiral Kuznetsov. The Soviet Union's first aircraft carrier was never meant to be a carbon copy of its American counterparts. From the outset, it was designed not to project air superiority like a U.S. supercarrier, but to function as a multi-role warship, defending Soviet waters from enemy submarines, countering NATO's surface fleets, and extending the reach of missile-armed aircraft into contested seas. Despite its ambitions, the ship's future was uncertain from the start. In a country where military secrecy and political maneuvering dictated nearly every aspect of defense projects, even the name of the ship became a shifting target. Construction began in 1982 at the Nikolaev shipyard, a historic facility located in present-day Ukraine, once a powerhouse of Soviet naval production. The vessel was first christened Riga, but as the years passed, it was renamed Leonid Brezhnev, then Tbilisi, before finally settling on Admiral Kuznetsov. According to maritime superstition, renaming a ship is an invitation to misfortune. Some say this initial shift in official titles would doom Admiral Kuznetsov. However, on paper, this was set to become the Soviet Navy's crown jewel. Unlike American carriers, which relied solely on their air wings for offense, Kuznetsov carried its own arsenal of 12 long-range P-700 Granite cruise missiles, each weighing 15,000 pounds, capable of reaching speeds of Mach 2.5 or 1,900 miles per hour, and strike targets nearly 400 miles away. These missions gave Kuznetsov a firepower advantage, but they also cemented its unusual classification. In the Soviet Union, it was officially designated as a heavy aircraft carrying missile cruiser. This wasn't just a matter of semantics, it was a tactical loophole. Under the Montreux Convention, no country could send aircraft carriers larger than 15,000 tons through the Turkish Straits, the narrow passage connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Kuznetsov weighed nearly 3 times the limit, but thanks to the technicality of its classification, she was legally allowed to slip through the straits, ensuring the Soviet Union could operate its first true carrier beyond the confines of its home waters. Troubled waters ahead. Despite Kuznetsov's promise, its design came with trade-offs that would haunt it for the rest of its service life. One of the ship's defining features was its ski-jump launch system, built at the end of the bow. Unlike American carriers, which used steam catapults to hurl aircraft into the sky with full fuel and weapon loads, Kuznetsov's ski jump forced its aircraft to engage their afterburners at full throttle, devouring fuel before they even left the deck. As a result, their operational range was significantly reduced, forcing Soviet pilots to carefully measure their mission times. But perhaps the ship's greatest flaw was its engine. Rather than employing gas turbines or nuclear power, Admiral Kuznetsov was powered by mazut, a thick, tar-like, and highly flammable heavy fuel oil, notorious for its inefficiency. The combustion process was unreliable, making breakdowns common and producing a thick black smoke that could be seen from miles away, exposing the ship's position long before enemy radar could detect it. But the Soviet Union had invested too much into this project to turn back now. For decades, Soviet leaders had dreamed of a navy that could challenge the dominance of the US, and Admiral Kuznetsov could be key to achieving it. However, in 1991, this dream came under threat. The Great Escape. By late August, hardliners within the Communist Party launched a coup that sent tanks rolling through Moscow streets. KGB agents and armored divisions surrounded the White House, the residence of the recently elected Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Martial law was declared, but instead of cowing the population into submission, thousands of civilians flooded the streets, forming human barricades against the advancing military. The coup leaders issued the order to open fire, but at the last moment, the soldiers refused. Some defected on the spot. Others simply abandoned their posts, accelerating the fall of the Soviet Union. Amid the chaos, Ukraine saw a golden opportunity to break free from the Soviet regime. Its political leaders had long sought independence, but now, with the central government paralyzed, it was time to make their move. On December 1, 1991, millions of Ukrainians took to the ballots for a national referendum. The results were decisive. 92% voted in favor of leaving their Soviet past behind. For the newly formed Russian Republic, this was a direct threat, as it was declared that crucial Soviet military assets on Ukrainian soil would now belong to the newly independent nation. Among the most prized assets was the unfinished aircraft carrier Admiral Kuznetsov, moored in the Crimean port of Sevastopol. Ukraine's newly elected president, Leonid Kravchuk, sent a message to the ship's commander, Viktor Yarygin, notifying that the vessel was now Ukrainian property and was to remain in port. But Russia had been working on the carrier for nearly a decade by this point. It was supposed to be the flagship of the Soviet Navy's future. They had no intention of giving up on it. Within hours, Yuri Ustimenko, deputy commander of Russia's Northern Fleet, arrived in Crimea. He carried a counter-order from Moscow. The carrier was to leave immediately. On the very day Ukraine voted for its independence, Admiral Kuznetsov broke away from the docks. The operation was so sudden that only a third of the crew was on board. The rest, still ashore, watched as the warship slipped out of Sevastopol's harbor. Understaffed and untested, it set the course for Russian-controlled waters. The journey was a desperate one. The Black Sea had never seen a ship of this scale attempt such a withdrawal under these conditions. Without a full crew, the vessel operated at the bare minimum. Despite these obstacles, Admiral Kuznetsov reached a Russian naval port in Murmansk. But the station wasn't equipped to accommodate a ship of this size, forcing the crew to improvise a dry dock to station the vessel. 2 more years passed before the ship could even begin launching aircraft. It wasn't until 1995 that Admiral Kuznetsov was declared fully operational, nearly 15 years after its construction had begun. But by the time it finally joined the fleet, the world of aircraft carriers had moved on. The United States had already commissioned the USS George Washington in 1992, a nuclear-powered supercarrier that operated with virtually unlimited range. It could sail continuously for 20 to 25 years without refueling, something Admiral Kuznetsov could never dream of matching with its outdated steam turbines and temperamental fuel. While the Russian carrier could hold around 24 aircraft, George Washington carried more than 80. Still, Russia had finally managed to create its first carrier. It may have been built for a different era and designed for a different war. But now, it was all Russia had, and they would have to make it work. The curse starts. In 1995, Admiral Kuznetsov was ready for its first deployment. Russia's flagship was sent on a 3-month Mediterranean tour in late December to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Russian Navy. The carrier sailed out with an air wing of 13 Su-33 fighters, 2 Su-25 UTG strike aircraft, and 11 helicopters. Escorted by a frigate, a destroyer, and an oiler, Kuznetsov cut through the waters with pride. Everything seemed to run according to plan for the first part of the deployment. The skies above the Mediterranean became a stage for daily flight operations. Russian Su-33s roared off the carrier's ski jump ramp, their afterburners lighting up the deck as they climbed up, cutting through the Israeli coast while being escorted by Israeli F-16s. Then, problems began to surface. The The ship's evaporators failed to distill seawater into fresh drinking water. Crew members, exhausted from working long shifts, struggled with dwindling reserves. Engineers fought to repair the system, but the problems persisted. Without a stable freshwater supply, Admiral Kuznetsov could not support operations for long. After limping back to port, Kuznetsov was sent to a Northern Fleet shipyard for repairs. But fixing the carrier wouldn't be a quick or easy task. Russia's economy was in shambles, and military funding had dried up. Keeping a carrier operational was a financial black hole. The maintenance cost could escalate to over $1 million per day, an impossible burden for the Navy struggling to keep the lights on. For nearly 2 years, Admiral Kuznetsov sat still. By the end of 1998, the ship was finally deemed seaworthy once again. Another Mediterranean deployment was planned for the year 2000, a chance for the Russian Navy to prove that its flagship was ready to reclaim its place on the world stage. But before the mission could begin, bad luck struck once again. On August 12, 2000, deep beneath the Barents Sea, the Russian Navy suffered one of its most devastating tragedies. The nuclear-powered submarine K-141 Kursk, participating in a major naval exercise for the first time in over a decade, was conducting a torpedo drill when something went wrong. The first explosion came without warning, an internal blast that ruptured the submarine's torpedo bay, igniting a chain reaction. The force of the detonation tore through the Kursk's reinforced hull, blowing open its bow. A second, far more powerful explosion followed moments later, the equivalent of several tons of TNT erupting in the confined space of the sub's forward compartments. This shockwave traveled through the decks, shaking nearby vessels and registering on seismic stations as far as Alaska. This had been a wake-up call for the Russian Navy, which was now forced to confront the brutal reality of keeping a fleet of aging, poorly maintained vessels alive. Admiral Kuznetsov was sent to assist in the rescue efforts, but it was too late. There were no survivors. The Kursk tragedy marked a turning point. The Russian Navy had long been struggling with outdated equipment and insufficient resources, but now their shortcomings had cost the lives of 118 sailors. As Kuznetsov returned to port, its future was more uncertain than ever. Disaster continues. It would be years before Russia dared to send its carrier back to the open sea, but by the time Admiral Kuznetsov finally sailed again, its role was limited to inspections and sea trials, small steps for a warship that had spent more time docked than in service. Still, the reports were promising. No major technical failures, no major malfunctions. By late 2004, the Russian Navy was cautiously optimistic. The carrier even participated in a fleet exercise in the Atlantic that October. After years of delays and setbacks, Kuznetsov was finally on the verge of rejoining the Northern Fleet as a fully operational warship. But the optimism would be short-lived. 1 year later, the bad luck of Kuznetsov returned, putting her back in the headlines for the wrong reasons. During a routine exercise at sea, an Su-33 fighter approached the deck for landing. The pilot, Yuri Korneyev, executed his descent perfectly, lining up with the carrier's runway and catching the arrestor cable. Everything seemed routine. Until, in an instant, it wasn't. The cable snapped. Instead of slowing down, the aircraft kept rolling forward at full momentum, its tailhook now useless. The pilot had only seconds to react. The edge of the deck was rushing toward him. With no other choice, Korneyev pulled the ejection handle. The canopy blew off, and the pilot was launched into the sky, just as the Su-33 overshot the runway and plummeted off the ship's stern. The jet, worth millions, sank into the water, settling on the ocean floor 3,600 feet below. The incident could have been enough to delay Kuznetsov's recommissioning indefinitely, but the Russian Navy had already waited too long. After a quick modernization, the carrier was formally reinstated into the Northern Fleet in September 2006. Over the next few years, the carrier was deployed for Mediterranean patrols and training exercises in the Barents Sea. Russian President Dmitry Medvedev even attended one of the drills, eager to showcase the might of his nation's flagship. But the failures kept piling on. Each time they fixed one issue, another two emerged. In 2009, while anchored near Turkey, a short circuit deep within the ship's electrical systems ignited a fire. The flames quickly spread through the hull, thick smoke filling the corridors as crew members scrambled to contain the blaze. One crew member, trapped in the chaos, did not make it out. Barely a month later, the carrier was sailing off the coast of Ireland, when European maritime satellites detected something alarming. An oil spill, massive in scale, contaminating the waters. Reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to investigate, and when they arrived, the source of the leak became unmistakable. The oil was pooling around Admiral Kuznetsov. At first, Russia denied any involvement, but as pressure mounted and evidence became undeniable, the truth surfaced. The ship had been refueling at the time, and somewhere between 20 to 30 tons of oil had spilled into the ocean. Or at least that was Russia's admission. British officials, after their own assessments, placed the number much higher, estimating the spill to be closer to 300 tons. It was an environmental disaster, a diplomatic embarrassment, and yet another black mark on Kuznetsov's already tarnished record. The Russian Navy, unwilling to admit their flagship was plagued with failures, downplayed the event, blaming it on human error rather than technical issues. No further details were provided. On the battlefield at last. In 2016, Admiral Kuznetsov was finally given the chance to redeem herself. For the first time since her commissioning over 2 decades earlier, she was being deployed for actual combat. This was the culmination of years of investment, maintenance, and modernization efforts. Her mission took her to the eastern Mediterranean, just off the coast of Syria, where she led the largest Russian naval deployment since the Cold War. Accompanied by 7 warships, her deck carried Su-33 fighters, MiG-29KR KUBR multi-role aircraft, and a group of naval helicopters. But the Kremlin wasn't taking any chances. Kuznetsov's reputation for mechanical failures loomed large. To avoid a potentially humiliating disaster, the Russian Navy assigned her a dedicated tugboat, an unspoken admission that at any moment, the flagship of the Russian fleet might simply break down at sea. On November 15, 2016, Admiral Kuznetsov launched her first ever combat sorties. Her air wing struck terrorist targets in Syria using 1,100-pound precision-guided munitions, with the Russian Ministry of Defense later claiming the strikes had taken out at least 30 militants, including 3 field commanders. Kuznetsov was proving she could be more than just an outdated piece of Soviet ambition. During her deployment, she participated in more than 40 combat missions, hitting approximately 1,252 targets, her most active and successful campaign. Yet, even in her moment of glory, Kuznetsov couldn't completely break free from her curse. On 2 separate occasions during the Syrian deployment, aircraft were lost to the sea again as Kuznetsov's arresting gear failed. One of the incidents involved a MiG-29K returning from a mission, which was ordered to circle the carrier while engineers hurried to repair the cables. For precious minutes, the pilot obeyed, hoping for a signal that it was safe to land. But the fix never came. The aircraft ran out of fuel, and with nowhere else to go, the pilot ejected, leaving yet another Russian warplane to sink into the ocean. By early 2017, the Russian government announced that Admiral Kuznetsov would return home. The official reason was that Russia was dialing back its involvement in Syria. As Kuznetsov turned back home, UK Defense Secretary Michael Fallon made Russia's defense ministry furious upon stating, quote, "We're keeping a close eye on the Admiral Kuznetsov as it skulks back to Russia, a ship of shame whose mission has only extended the suffering of the Syrian people." The final chapter. In an attempt to keep its only aircraft carrier afloat, Russia launched yet another modernization of Admiral Kuznetsov in 2017. The goal was to extend her life by another 25 years with a complete overhaul of her power plant and electronic systems. The work was set to take place at the port city of Murmansk, with completion expected by 2021. But Kuznetsov's curse was unforgiving. In October 2018, as Admiral Kuznetsov was being lifted from PD-50, Russia's largest floating dry dock, alarms blared as the entire structure began sinking. One of the 70-ton cranes collapsed, plummeting onto the ship's deck like a wrecking ball. A massive 200-square-foot gash was torn into Kuznetsov's hull. Workers scrambled for their lives. Some fell into the freezing water, flailing as their colleagues rushed to pull them out. One worker went missing, never to be seen again. 4 others were injured. The Russian government moved swiftly to downplay the catastrophe. Officials insisted the damage was not critical. In reality, this had crushed any hope of Kuznetsov being operational by 2021. The carrier lingered in limbo, forced into even more extensive and costly repairs. In 2022, Alexei Rachmanov, Director General of the United Shipbuilding Corporation, optimistically proclaimed, quote, "The dock repairs are almost completed. The only thing left is to prepare the ship for repairs at the moorage." The repairs of Admiral Kuznetsov are scheduled to be over in 2024. As of 2025, the carrier remains stuck in port. Many now believe Admiral Kuznetsov will never sail again. Now, desperate for manpower amidst the war in Ukraine, the Russian government has even reportedly begun stripping the carrier for a different kind of service, with up to 1,500 sailors reassigned to fight on the front lines. However, Russia's Federal Security Service insists that the vessel remains a strategic asset. According to Russian claims, Ukrainian intelligence has reportedly attempted to sabotage the ship, with Russian officials stating that a Ukrainian agent tried to recruit a Russian worker at the shipyard, offering money and an escape route in exchange for carrying out an attack on the vessel. Whether these reports are accurate or not, Ukraine has little reason to fear Admiral Kuznetsov. Deploying Kuznetsov in the Ukrainian war would be a gamble, with her potentially becoming a stranded hulk floating aimlessly in the Black Sea. Whether Admiral Kuznetsov is eventually decommissioned or continues to drain Russian resources for years to come, one thing is certain: she will forever be one of the unluckiest warships ever to serve in the Russian Navy. Special thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring our video. Ensure your personal information stays protected by clicking the link below and using promo code DARKSEAS to receive 20% off. Take back control of your digital privacy with Delete Me before your data becomes another Admiral Kuznetsov.